Oz Avery, who's the facilitator of the English Language Learners Alliance here at the RAL Northeastern Islands. Hello, MP.
Hey, Peter. Thanks so much. Thanks for greeting everybody, and I'd like to contribute my own greetings and welcome to so many people that are on the event right now, and it's good to see people that I recognize as well as new people from within our region and also outside our region. So we're very excited to have everybody on. So welcome to this BREACH event, Bridging Research to Practice, English Language Learners and the Common Core State Standards, a topic that is very much on the minds of so many of our educators in our region and across the country. I'm just going to do a quick overview of the agenda and what our goals are and how we're going to proceed through this hour and a half. As you can see, we have our agenda up now. And in a short while, our director, Jill Weber, will be sharing with you some information about the current scope of work of the Regional Educational Laboratories and, in particular, RELNI, which is the Regional Educational Laboratory for the Northeast and Islands. We will have our keynote presentation from Dr. Kenji Hakuta in two different segments. And after each segment, we will have a short period for questions and answers that we will bring up those questions from the chat room, from the participant chat room. So please make sure that you enter your questions in the chat room. After those two segments, we will have Dr. Pedro Ruiz give his observations and talk about some of the implications of the Common Core State Standards for ELL professionals at the state and district level. We'll have a short wrap-up at the very end, and we'll share with you ways that you can stay in touch with us. So our goals for this event are the following. We hope that it will deepen your understanding of the instructional shifts in the Common Core State Standards and the next generation state standards, particularly the implications of these shifts with respect to the language demands for ELLs. As we all know, the language demands that are in the Common Core State Standards are going to be pretty high for everyone, but they're especially going to be very difficult for those of our students who are English language learners because the demands will be not only double, but they will be tripled, having to understand not only the learning of English, but also the content information that they will be receiving through that medium of instruction. So it's going to be very challenging for English language learners and for the teachers that will be working with them. Just a reminder about how to submit your questions because we have so many people on the line. We will keep the lines muted, but you can submit your questions at any time by typing them into the chat room. Shai, who is the researcher working with me on the ELL Alliance, will be keeping track of those questions and sending them over to me to present to Kenji for his remarks. If there are clarifying questions, we will be directing them during the presentation, but substantive questions will be posed during the Q&A period following each segment. I also want to let you all know that one of the things that we will be doing after the event is through is we will be going over those questions that haven't been answered, and we will be preparing responses in writing that will be available on our website, and we will let you know through email that these questions have been answered and have been posted. You can see that you've already started, we have a poll that's up. And one of the things we'd like to do is just get a sense of who is on the line. So if you could respond to the poll and enter your responses so we can begin to see what the percentages are of the participants who are on the line right now. So the next poll is also to enter what your role is. And we have one for where you're from. So if you can respond to that. So it looks like we may have about half and half from within our region and also from outside our region, which is nice. And we have one other poll coming in. So how long have you worked in the field of English language learners? Whoa. All right, so let's see what we're getting here. A lot of people who have had more than 15 years of experience, so we seem to have a rather seasoned group of practitioners on the line. More than 15 years, 5 to 10, and 25% with 0 to 4 years. So nice range. So welcome, everybody. This gives us a sense of who's on and what would be important for us to be focusing on. So with this brief introduction, I am going to be turning over the presentation to Jill Weber, who is the director of the REL Northeastern Islands, and she will be sharing some information with you about our mandate as the REL for this region. Jill?
Thanks, MP, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see this huge turnout. There's obviously a lot of interest in this topic, so it's great that so many people were able to join us. Just a brief bit of information about the REL so you have some context to understand how we're working. As you've heard, this is the Northeastern Islands REL. We're one of 10 RELs across the country, and we serve New England, New York, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, a large and diverse territory with many overlapping but many distinct needs as well. This is the second REL contract that we've been working on. We just ended a 6-year contract in 2011 and just started the new 5-year contract in January of this year. So we're thrilled to still be working in the region and connecting researchers and practitioners and helping make available research findings so they're usable in your context. We have, I'm speaking from EDC, as Peter mentioned in the warm-up or the welcome. There are several of us here in the EDC offices in Waltham, Massachusetts, and we're the prime contractor for this contract. We also have 2 major partners that help us in this work, Learning Innovations at WestEd, located just north of Boston, and AIR, American Institutes for Research in DC. And as I mentioned, this is a 5-year contract that will run through 2017. If you've been with us in the last REL contract and looked at some of our work in this contract, you'll see that there's been a shift. There's an emphasis in this contract on working through and working with groups of policymakers and stakeholders. And these groups are formed into what are called research alliances. So it's really these core groups, and we have 8 in our REL, through which most of our work is being done. These groups are comprised of state and district level stakeholders that come together to create a research agenda, to pose important problems in a number of content areas, and to help us shape the work that we do, both in the use of data systems and in conducting and using research findings. You see that we have 8 alliances, as I mentioned. Today's Bridge event is being hosted by our English Language Learners Alliance that MP is the facilitator for. But we're also focusing on a number of other key critical issues across the region: early childhood, college and career readiness, educator effectiveness. We're working with rural districts on their specific needs, and we're working with urban districts on school improvement kinds of projects. And we have an alliance that serves Puerto Rico and another one that serves Virgin Islands, focusing on college and career with some emphasis on dropout prevention. So a lot of work. We're creating portfolios and bodies of work in each of these areas. Bridge events is one kind of vehicle by which we share the research that we're doing and other research that's been conducted in these areas. But you'll see if you visit our website or talk to any of our staff or people that are involved with our research alliances, that we're really here to make sure that research is understandable and usable for people that are making decisions. So we work through the data systems. We help schools and districts and states understand what data is available, and we make sure that that data is useful for people. So that's just a little brief background about who and what we are. Make sure that you come to our website. Our work has just started, as I said, in January. We just formed these alliances through the spring and the summer, and we're ready to start year 2 with a big complement of work. So I'm going to turn it back over to MP, and we'll kick off the bridge event.
Thanks, Jill. So just again, very briefly, I wanted to share with you what the goal of the English Language Learners Alliance is. And basically, we're developing this alliance around the use of data to understand the diversity of our ELL populations. Very often we hear statements that seem to imply that all ELLs are alike, and we really want to bring home the point that the ELL population in the United States has a great diversity in terms of the resources and the backgrounds that they bring with them. And so understanding the diversity of the ELL populations is a key aspect of our alliance. And in tandem with that, to explore the programs and services that best meet these diverse needs. So we really are focusing on the issue that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach to the education of English language learners, and that quality education for English language learners has to take into account the diversity of the population and the diversity of programs and services that they need. You see here that I am the Alliance facilitator. Shai Foxman is the Alliance researcher, and we have Carolyn Parker as our senior research scientist, and I will describe the study that she is conducting starting this year as our first study associated with the ELL Alliance. Just want to let you know that we have a core planning group that helps set the direction and gives advice on the direction of what the Alliance should be working on. And you will note that we have 3 of our states that are very deeply involved in this core planning group. So we have Connecticut represented, Rhode Island, and New York. At the same time, we continue to reach out to our other states in order to expand the membership, not only in the core planning group, but also in the larger membership of bringing in participants from across our region, and as you can also see, sometimes nationally, but to bring them into other activities that are sponsored by the ELL Alliance. Our goal here is also to bring in researchers into the core planning group. So at this moment, we have a researcher, a faculty member from Rhode Island College who has been on our core planning group. And our hope is that we can begin to bring in other researchers so that it's not only the research that the REL is doing, but it's also building a body of work with other partners in higher education and in other research organizations. So just very briefly, we are starting a study this year that looks at the characteristics and academic outcomes of English language learners in a New England district. So our goal with this study is to identify the relationship between ELL program types and academic success. One of the issues that has come up as we have met as a core planning group is the fact that there are many different programs and many different services that are being offered, but they're sometimes not well matched with what the needs of our EL populations are. And so this study begins to look at that connection between program types, types of students and the characteristics, and academic success. Once this study is completed, we will be publishing the results of the study both as a technical report, but also as a more user-friendly report that would provide other districts with information on how they might be able to conduct a similar study. So that in brief is a little bit about the work that has already started through the ELL Alliance. And so before I turn it over to Professor Hakuta, what I'd like to do is just now have you participate in another poll to begin to see what you have already been doing with respect to the implementation of the Common Core standards, and then more specifically, what might have already been happening in your district or your state or in your settings around the alignment of the Common Core standards with local English proficiency standards and what the implications are for training and so on. So I'm beginning to see a pattern here where it seems that most of you are just beginning to implement the Common Core standards and maybe just at the very, very start of beginning to align the CCSS with the English language proficiency standards that you already have in your settings and providing training on the implications of the Common Core standards for ELLs. So there's a lot of work that I think we have to look forward to, and I think the information that Dr. Hakuta will be sharing with us will help in some of that work. So let me now introduce Dr. Hakuta. You already know him, probably know him from conferences that you have attended, but also know him from a lot of the research that he has already done and all the contributions that he has made to the field. At the moment, Professor Hakuta is teaching at Stanford University in the School of Education, where he is the Lee L. Jacks Professor, and he is also the co-founder of this very exciting project, Understanding Language, and Dr. Hakuta will be talking about that in a little while, but that is going to be, I think, a tremendous source of information for those of us in the field who need the assistance in making the translation from the Common Core standards to what it means for English language learners. Dr. Hakuta's areas of focus have been in the areas of bilingualism and second language acquisition, and his policy interest is in improving educational opportunities for language minority students. He has been very active in that area. And if you read his biography in the home page, and I'm going to quote what he says there, he also has a quirky policy interest in how the research infrastructure can be improved to support good education research, an acquired taste that he developed while chairing the policy board at the U.S. Department of Education. And we are very grateful to his deep interest in policy issues and that he's at the forefront of advocating for ELLs around policy at the federal level. Dr. Hakuta is at a stage in his career where he's very interested in actions more than in traditional scholarships, in understanding what helps schools, helps teachers, helps the training of future scholars to do the work that is directly relevant to improving education. So with that introduction, I would like to now turn it over to Dr. Hakuta. Kenji, you're on.
Hey. All right, thank you very much, and good afternoon. Even on the West Coast, it's good afternoon, and I appreciate that that there are so many of you participating in this webinar. If I were standing in front of you, I'd feel nervous. I'm really glad to be able to present in this particular format where all I'm looking at is the same screen that you're looking at. I don't think that anything that I'm going to say today is going to be entirely new. I think that as a field, the field of English language learners and addressing their needs in both supporting second language or English language development and also in supporting content development has been sort of basically our main menu. We've just been trying to figure out how to do it as a field in the context of evolving policy and various political events and of course, some degree of improvement and better understanding through research of the basic processes involved. And in thinking about the presentation today about understanding language, which is an initiative not just about that's really a collaborative work. I happen to be fortunate enough to be co-chairing it. By the way, my screen just sort of disappeared. I don't know if, oh yeah, how do I advance the slides here? Do I have the ability to do that, or is...
Yeah, Kenji, if you see in the bottom left-hand corner of where your picture is, there are two arrows.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, great. Um, so what I'd like to do is, when we talk about how a new reform effort, which is essentially what the Common Core state standards effort is really a kind of reform energy created by the initiative of states to adopt the Common Core. Um, I think it's really important to put it in the historical context in which this reform is occurring, as well as the state of our knowledge. And so what I'm going to do is really kind of put the first part of of my remarks in sort of thinking about English language learners in the Common Core in that historical context. And so that's my plan, is just to spend about 15 minutes or so right now going through that, and then we'll have some Q&A, and then in the second segment to talk more about implications for professional development, practice, and policy. And in history, this sort of goes back almost to the very beginning. Many of you indicated you've been in this field for longer than 15 years, and I would put myself in that category. I go back, I think one of my first publications on second language acquisition was actually dated 1974, which is the date of the Lau v. Nichols Supreme Court decision affirming the educational rights of English language learners or limited English proficient students. And it's kind of exciting because at that time, most of my work was kind of the precursor to what we know today about the functional localization of various cognitive and language functions in the brain. You know, in those days, in the 70s, we were still talking about very gross distinctions between right brain, left brain, between Wernicke's and Broca's areas of the brain that might control different parts of language. We knew about things like the visual cortex and so forth. And now we're far better. And so the picture that I have down the bottom are pictures from fMRI magnetic resonance studies that are able to really pinpoint areas of the brain that get activated as different kinds of psychological mental functions get activated. And the reason I bring this back is that we've been trying since Lau to connect language and cognition, language and academic content, or whatever the lingo is. My own academic training was in a field called experimental psycholinguistics, and that really had to do with psycholinguistics, the psychology of language, and how language and the rest of the mind interact, how much specificity there is around language functions, but also the kinds of interactions and integration that happens around information in the language and the brain. And I think, it's appropriate, I think, to say that the field has been trying in various ways to pull those two strands together of language and content. And I think we should think about the current state of the Common Core and English language learners as a particular sort of instantiation of that effort to try to bring the two parts of the of the mind or the brain together. Another framework that we've been working with, as many of you are familiar with, is the Castaneda standards. That this be based on sound theory, that the program needs to be implemented with adequate resources, producing results, and that if those three prongs of Castaneda are not fulfilled, then you go back and either reform your implementation or revise the theory and so forth. And from a civil rights enforcement point of view, I think the questions that get asked are how are the language acquisition or English language acquisition needs of students being addressed by the program? What kind of theory do we have around time course of acquisition and so forth? What kind of theory do we have about the relationship between the native language and the second language? And what are we doing to ensure that access to core academic content is also guaranteed or addressed by the particular approach. And I think we've been trying over various reform efforts to try to address those those two strands. And yet, in the world of policy, I browsed the web looking for a picture of fragmentation. I like to often give my talks, as those of you who have heard me speak, based around photos rather than words, because often words on PowerPoint is a great way to put people to sleep. And I couldn't find a good one for fragmentation, but I thought of the two Xerox machines as a picture of fragmentation. Many of you who have been in education in the 70s and 80s will certainly resonate to this. The idea that there is, kind of in order to fulfill the fiscal accountability requirements of federal law, such as Title I and Title VII, or currently Title III, that you might end up with kind of multiple resources, redundant resources, just in order to be able to keep track of how many copies are being made for Title I purposes versus for Title VII purposes. And I think many of us in the 70s and 80s came to the realization that unintended effects of fragmentation of programs, essentially into sort of a language component and a academic content component, or maybe a Title I component and a Title VII component, that policies have the unintended effect of leading to these kinds of fragmentation. And that really gave birth, along with the low academic performance of American students, to kind of a call for reform and the call for standards. That is the idea of addressing the problems of fragmentation by saying, well, we actually don't mind mixing of resources if you can end up at a common endpoint, so standards and accountability around it and so forth. And so that's kind of one version, at least, of the call for academic standards, and that led to essentially the first reform of the ESEA, resulting in the Clinton era legislation of Improving America's Schools Act, which was really the first federal law, just following on the heels of Goals 2000, the other accompanying law, to address standards and move away from the kinds of fragmented services and so forth. And during this time, I think those of you who have been in this field for a while realize that usually if you're advocating for inclusion of English language learners, you're usually playing a big game of catch-up, as in not tomato ketchup, but catching up to the train that's leaving the station. I think that was certainly the case in the early 1990s. I noticed Donna Christian is among the people attending this webinar, and Donna Christian was among a group that I was involved in, called the Stanford Working Group, that tried to kind of get the English language learner issue engaged in the Clinton era reform into sort of a meaningful discussion, but often we were kind of late. And again, one of the real opportunities of the Common Core is I think we're now, even though we're still getting into this conversation somewhat late, we're a little bit earlier in the stage than we have been in the past, and so that I think we're showing a little bit of improvement in what we've been doing. The second wave of reform, and then again the Common Core, is really what I see as wave 3 of standards-based reform. Wave 2 came in No Child Left Behind, the current version of ESEA, and I'm just going to highlight a few words in there that really illustrate some of the characteristics of what's in No Child Left Behind. And the big words are really around inclusion, And that piece was started in the Clinton era in Standards 1, but it really, in this case, this really was inclusion with the kinds of accountability pressures that No Child Left Behind brought into the into ESEA that gives us things like AYP and so forth, and disaggregation, of course, by English proficiency status, which gives the kinds of teeth and attention to English language learners. For many people who love to hate No Child Left Behind, this disaggregation component, faulty as it might be in its implementation, is still a piece that's really important in order to bring attention to English language learners. And then the other piece that No Child Left Behind brought to us was the idea of English language proficiency standards under Title III and assessments around those standards, and also that they be aligned with academic content. So this sort of, again, trying to put those two pieces of the brain together, the language and the academic content, that's kind of reflected in an effort in this law. Now we're in the entering the third phase of standards-based reform, the Common Core, and one way to characterize it is that it is a lot of energy that was generated by by the number of states who've signed on to it, by the level of engagement of foundations, including the ones who have funded the Understanding Language Initiative, Gates Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, and so forth, that have really kind of hopped onto and, in fact, played a role in some ways in catalyzing the reform energy around this. But it's, I think it's appropriate to say that this is really, the major reform wave sweeping through the land now. And why am I showing you pictures of camels here? Well, our claim is that one of the reasons why those of us interested in English language learners, or for that matter, anyone interested in the relationship between language and academic content, which really applies to all students, the reason why we should be paying attention to the Common Core is because of the particular angle at which it hits academic content. And the reason I'm showing you the pictures of these camels is actually to make that point. These are actually, what you see as camels are not the camels themselves. It's the shadow of the camels. This is an award-winning photo by National Geographic photographer Steinmetz, and it's the actual camels are the white things that look like alligators at the base of the shadows, and you really recognize them as camels only because of the particular angle at which the sun is hitting the camel. And so in a similar way, one argues that the reason why the Common Core is of interest to those of us interested in language should be because of the way in which language and the language demands are characterized in the Common Core. And that has intrigued us, and by us I refer to Understanding Language, which is really, it's not a formal organized center. It's just a bunch of people interested and concerned about the implications of the Common Core for English language learners, who came together under the auspices of funding from the Carnegie Corporation and the Gates Foundation, among others. And we came together to sort of look at the shadows, to say the language is really being profiled in a very significant and profound way in the Common Core, and if we leverage it well, it will really be promising in terms of advancing the interests of English language learners' language as well as content development. And the negative side also is that if we don't address that, there are many perils in even increasing the gaps and opportunities for English language learners, because the language demands contained in the Common Core are going to be much greater and more profound than they are in the current standard. So the Understanding Language Group consists, my co-chair is Maria Santos, who those of you in the Northeast probably remember her fondly as the director of ELL services in New York City, and she's now in Oakland, as well as some of the authors of the Common Core, English Language Arts Standards and Math Standards, so Susan Pimentel and Phil Darrow. We also pay attention to the Next Generation Science Standards, and Helen Quinn, who chaired the National Research Council Frameworks Committee on which the Next Generation Science Standards is based, is involved with us. We also have ELL experts in those who have worked in English Language Arts, Math, and Science. Oki Lee from New York University is actively engaged with us, George Bunch, Judith Moskowitz, and others who have worked in a variety of capacities around bilingualism. Aida Walke from WestEd, who works on supporting sheltered instruction through her program, QTEL. And then we have policy actors as well. Delia Pompa from National Council of La Raza. Our big institutional partners include the Council of Chief State School Officers. Chris Minnick, who just was appointed their executive director, has been working with us. And also Gabriela Uro from the Council of Great City Schools. So we've worked with kind of states and districts who are important players in this arena. So that's the Understanding Language Initiative. What we recognize is that the new standards raise the bar for content learning and highlight the role of construct-relevant disciplinary language, and that they define language not just in cognitive terms, but in terms of teacher to student as well as student to student discourse, so that they define language in very different ways than just in the traditional ways of thinking about grammar and vocabulary. And that if you look through the standards, and I'm sure all of you have to varying degrees studied the contents of the Common Core, that what I've highlighted here in red around making effective arguments, evaluating complex texts, or building logical progressions in math and so forth, constructing arguments, that these are all important language functions that are embedded in the content standards, and those are really the shadows of the camels that I was referring to. Likewise with the science standards as well, around argumentation and reasoning, developing explanations and solutions and so forth. I'll point to resources that give further meat to these arguments towards the end of this presentation. But everyone likes to talk about their favorite shifts in the new standards. And everyone, of course, is entitled to have their favorite shifts. And of course, like anything, it's a very complicated enterprise. And so there are many features of it that you could point to. But we like to point to various pieces of the new standards in ELA, math, and science that really call out the language functions that are contained in those standards. And that's really at the heart of the work that we're trying to do. And our argument is that because of that, students are challenged to engage in productive oral and written group work with peers, engage in effective oral and written interactions with teachers, explain and demonstrate their knowledge using emerging complex language and other communicative strategies in different settings, and extract meaning from complex written texts. So if you'll allow me to just caricature in a kind of cartoon way, if we thought about sort of the overlap of those two areas of the brain, the content and the language, to oversimplify, in the old paradigm as focusing on vocabulary and on grammar, that one can argue that in the new paradigm, we had a little bit of a PowerPoint fail here. Those texts should be embedded in the intersection there of the Venn diagram, but it's not just vocabulary and sentence structures, but also discourse and text and explanation, argumentation, purposes of the text and structure of text and so forth, and those are the kinds of academic language that's really highlighted, and furthermore that these have very specific manifestations depending on the content area, and therefore it's really important to really think very deeply about the characteristics of how language is used in science instruction and math and in language arts. So I think I was doing a little bit of catch up just because we got going a few minutes late, so I had to kind of skip over it. But I think so. Those are sort of the main sort of outlines that we're focusing on, and I'd love to hear whether you agree with the way in which I've kind of characterized our kind of the opportunities that exist right now about highlighting the characteristics of language. As I promised at the beginning, probably very little of what I've said is new. It's really the opportunities that have been created by the Common Core and the interest in the Common Core, as well as the policies that exist currently around connecting academic content and language that I think is giving us some of the new opportunities. And then after we take some questions, I'll come back and elaborate further about the implications of this for the work that we as a field have ahead of us. So now, Shai, or I haven't been able, as I talk, to follow all the comments. I saw that there was quite a bit of typing coming along, so can you pick a few out of there for me?
Yes, and you did ask people to respond to how they see what you had presented in terms of the conceptual framework and the theoretical framework and the underpinnings and all of that. So I'm going to give people time to write in their remarks if they want to. But in the meantime, we do have some questions.
Sure.
And there are a couple of questions that have been posed, and I'm going to combine them because it seems that they are very related to each other. And that has to do with how does the Common Core state standards, in your estimation, address or can be addressed for the needs of English language learners who are at very beginning levels of English language development. And there are two sort of settings in which that may be the case, such as in a state like Massachusetts, where we have a primarily English-only policy, and so there is very little support for the use of a student's first language. And then also in terms of how it applies to SCIF students or students with interrupted formal schooling who tend to come at an older age, mostly high school age, and yet are at very beginning levels of English language development. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's, those are the areas, I think part of why they're raised is because those are the areas where the alarm bells should be ringing the loudest in terms of how and what we should be doing to address their needs. In some ways, addressing the areas where English learners who are at intermediate or advanced levels of English language proficiency, their needs in language are often very similar to the needs of even monolingual or other English proficient students in trying to meet the academic language demands of the Common Core. And so the students who are either at the very beginning stages, those who are in programs where they don't have access to native language instruction that really can provide the kinds of high-level language functions that are needed to negotiate this kind of content, or SCIF students is really that the alarm bell should ring loud because of the widening gap of expectations about what these students will need to do. I think there's really no way other than to expect that additional time, additional resources are going to be needed just by saying you need to jump this high in the same amount of time is really is going to be really demanding. I think that one needs to look at promising practices of, for example, the ways in which the internationals is addressing the needs of SIPE students as well as the students who come with academically appropriate or age-appropriate academic literacy development in their native language. I also think that one needs to really carefully think through what the sequence is in ESL or ELD instruction is at the beginning levels that really allow students to use their rather limited resources in grammar, for example, to still engage in cognitively high demanding kinds of activities, and those are that's admittedly a real challenge. But how to get the ELD or ESL instruction focus to support that is really important as well. I certainly don't pretend to have answers to that.
So thank you for that, Kenji. I know that there have been a number of comments about wanting to know more about the nuts and bolts of what do we actually do in the classroom when we have students who are at the very beginning levels of English proficiency and yet have to meet the demands of content learning as well as content assessment. So there also have been a couple of questions that have to do with what assessments are there out there that are now tied to the Common Core standards.
Yes. Well, I think it'll be quite an eye-opener if you haven't done so already to either look at PARC or Smarter Balance, whichever is appropriate in your state, at some of the sample items. These are just the first release, draft form, and so forth. And I think one will quickly realize that the demands are really high, not just in content, but also in the language demands, especially in the more performance-based types of items contained in there. And I think that's a real eye-opener. One other thing I would say is that the language demands that are going to be created for teachers as essentially enablers of language use in the classroom are going to be applied just as much to bilingual programs as they will to monolingual classrooms. So if you look at the kinds of expectations about students being able to understand the reasoning of other students in math, or being able to negotiate argumentation in science with other students, that's a challenge for all teachers. Who, especially those who are more in the sage and the stage model, because what teachers need to think about is not as essentially the models of language. They need to shift from being the models of language to thinking of themselves as language enablers for students, enabling students to be able to use language with each other. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for all teachers, and for bilingual teachers, I think that's going to be just as much of a challenge. But it's an exciting one because it's really making instruction focus on listening to what the students are saying and trying to improve the quality of the language negotiation that's going on within the classroom.
So we have a question here as a follow-up to what you just said. When you say language enablers, are you picturing a primary focus on oral language?
I don't think it really just applies to oral language. In fact, I think it applies as much, or if you think about the text-based evidence kind of features of English language arts to the text as well. But I think I'm thinking that we need to think. I was toying with this idea just the other day that in the old days we talked about Chomsky talked about the language acquisition device, the LAD, and I think we need to move from LAD to LED, as in language enabling device, as the role of the teacher. That we need to think about how to facilitate engagement of students with each other in meaningful uses of language around academic content. I think it's a huge challenge, but it's an exciting one, because that is really truly the one of the main functions of language, is not as simply a cognitive representation, but as a medium of exchange between students.
So, Kenji, I'm going to move on and ask you to continue with your presentation, and just for our participants to let them know that we are keeping track of their questions, and as I had mentioned earlier, we will be responding to some of those in writing later on. So, Kenji?
Yes, thank you. And this part is really less structured, I think, than the earlier one. So, and I'm really hoping that what this will spark is a lot of discussion and excitement in the field to say, let's talk about what implications this has for how we support teachers to have this much kind of richer, Common Core supportive instruction going on in the classroom, and instruction that also connects in a meaningful way, instruction that happens in the ESL context with what happens in the content areas. And this picture is just here to say that we, the professional development problem is not just sort of, how do we package and send it out the door or deliver it. I mean, that we know how to do that, and we do a lot of it. But really acknowledging that it really fits in the context of a bunch of layers, that there's a real systemic element to this, that ultimately what we're trying to do is to affect the last mile of instruction, that is how students and teachers engage with content using relevant and rich language. But what role do publishers and test makers, site and district leaders, pre-service, in-service providers, advocates, and leaders at the state and federal levels, how do we all kind of work together to kind of deliver the final intended impact on instruction? And so one way to think about what understanding language has been trying to do is to have a dialogue about this at these different levels. So we have been, and you can go to our website if you already haven't done so. You can Google understanding language, or you can go directly to ell.stanford.edu, and you'll see a bunch of resources there. And if you go to that website now, you'll be among the first to come to our new website. We just did a soft relaunch of a revised website, and it's got a bunch of resources that I'll point to as we talk. But our purpose really is to share, create public dialogue with school districts around ELL-oriented instructional exemplars and strategies for ELA math and science. I know that many of you in this webinar already do this, and I think we can't have enough public dialogue about what we do, how we do it, how we can improve on doing it, and so forth, and how that's a discourse that needs to be repeated at the level of school sites, of school districts, at the state levels, federal level, and so forth. And so I think it's what we're trying to do is simply maybe we're trying to in a sense instantiate our argument that we're creating some some academic language, so to speak, around this kind of discourse. We also are trying to engage with the assessment consortia to optimize attention to construct-relevant language in the development of the assessment systems. And so, as I said, we have as our partners the Council of Chief State School Officers, and they, of course, played a large role in working with states to develop and adopt the Common Core, but they also continue to play a role in working with PARC and Smarter Balanced. There are also now two English language proficiency assessment consortia. One is the one that's been around for a while, WIDA in Wisconsin, WIDA. And the second was just created, led by the state of Oregon, called ELPA 21, ELPA 21. And that's about 12 states or so that have come together, and they'll be working on common assessment. And there needs to be sort of a cross-assessment consortia dialogue around issues such as a common definition of English language learners, which all the consortia have agreed to. But also, I think around the content area, one of the big issues is really being sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in trying to make assessments in content be language neutral, or at least not penalize English language learners. And yet, if you, because of our argument that the Common Core contains a large kind of component of language demands, those need to be assessed. You can't avoid them and remove them, but they need to be assessed and understood. Psychometricians can have ways of kind of essentially weighing the component or the contribution of the construct relevant language in the content assessments. And so we're sort of involved in those kinds of conversations, along with the set of usual suspects who work in the area of English learners and assessment. And focusing public policy discourse at national, state, and local levels to support instruction and leadership that builds on attention given to the opportunities created by the new standards. And so there are various policy actors in this, the Aspen Institute or the Alliance for Excellent Education. They just came out with a policy brief on ELLs and recommendations for state policy. The Hunt Institute. And so these are the kinds of conversations that we're trying to engage with and to try to kind of keep ELLs on the front burner. In terms of another related resource that probably many of you are already familiar with, but if not, you definitely want to check this out. We helped support the development of this through the Council of Chief State School Officers of something called the English Language Proficiency Development Framework. And this is a document that was produced to help states assess or evaluate how their English language proficiency standards correspond to the Common Core and to the next generation science standards. So in a sense, it's a document that lays out for people who look at standards what the language demands are of the content standards. And it's intended to be a technical tool for people who look at standards, but it also has, though, a significant piece that looks at the academic language components of separately for English language arts, math, and science. And this document was also had the involvement of several people from the WIDA consortium, who also are grappling with that issue of the academic demands in the Common Core. So that's another resource that you might want to look at if you already haven't. If you go to our website, what you'll see is this is the newly launched website. The earlier pictures I showed you was an old one, but I'm going to start with just pointing to the papers first. Many of the theoretical arguments that I gave at the first part of this presentation today, you can find support for among a series of papers that we commissioned. Hopefully, they're not too academic and too technical, and they were written to really speak to a broad audience. And there are 12 of them, and I know that there are quite a few school districts this last summer who already started using them for teachers, groups of teachers to develop professional learning communities and so forth around the papers. I do know that at least for some groups of practitioners, this has had some value. And they focus on, one is sort of practice in the content areas, another set of papers around language and literacy that are characterized by the Common Core, and then a set of papers around policy and building system capacity, including a paper that Linda Darling-Hammond and Maria Santos prepared on professional development and capacity building. And so hopefully those papers you'll find useful, and you can download them through this website. We also are trying to communicate through one of our partners, the Council of Great City Schools, and we've been engaged with some of the larger school districts that work through the Council of Great City Schools. We have developed some or are in the process of developing various exemplary or exemplars of instructional approaches, lesson units that instantiate what we mean around richly supporting academic language in the content areas. And we just posted, and so if you go to our website under teaching resources, you'll see a sample teaching resource around English language arts, which is intended mostly for the middle to advanced levels of English proficiency in middle school, an English language arts unit around persuasive text. Excuse me, I'm going to clear my throat for a sec here. And this was a unit that was developed by the Understanding Language team in working with West Ed and their Aida Walke's team in QTEL, and it's a unit that takes students all the way up to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and students working with that original complex text, but scaffolding a series of other texts that lead up to it, and reading other kinds of genres around speeches and persuasive texts. And we've had a number of school districts give us review this unit that we developed. We're in the process of piloting it with 3 school districts, and then we will be documenting the implementation and sharing some of the productive struggles that we expect will happen as we try to implement these units, and we'll be sharing that through our website. We also expect this winter to share some resources around math as well as science during this coming year. So those are some of the activities that we're currently engaged in, and we just hope, all of this is open source. We hope to share more videos of instruction. We're also in the process of figuring out how to create some free online course materials that could be used both for professional development purposes as well as for by universities. This is the acronym that you've probably seen in the papers is MOOCs, M-O-O-C-S, They're massive open online courses, and we're sort of jumping in that MOOC space and trying to create some free open courses that would support both the theory, the practice, and the policy components of Common Core implementation for English language learners. So that gives kind of our bird's eye. We're very interested in hearing some of the problems that you see out there in the field. One I'll just mention as you kind of create questions that another area where we're working in is how to work with smaller school districts. Many of the larger school districts have some capacity to start preparing for and thinking about this, but most of the school districts in the nation are relatively small, and they have a very different kind of capacity building issue, professional development needs, and so forth than larger school districts. So I think I've said enough here, and let me throw this back open for questions, and I know we need to also we have time for Pedro, and I'm sorry, Pedro, I just keep talking on and on here.
Yes, thank you, Kenji. We do have some questions that I've been asked actually to make sure that I pose to you. One of them that several people said, yes, please ask the question, has to do with the fact that there are students who appear to be orally proficient in English, but don't have literacy either in their native language and also are very low in English literacy skills. So again, what are your thoughts about working with students who have those characteristics?
Yeah, and I think the tension is, how do you what's the appropriate curriculum for those students, and especially I think the Common Core really opens up the window to give access to, or figuring out how to give access to original complex texts to students rather than some kind of digested summary version and so forth of the text for these students. And I think that poses a really important problem space for those of us who deliver English as a second language or ELD instruction, often in the middle schools or in high school for those students. And I think what's the right kind of way in which teachers could help support their students during that ELD time that works with the same text or the kind of pieces of the original text that the students are having to struggle with in social studies or in science or math or other areas. So I think it's a really important challenge, and I think it again creates perils and opportunities, but that's where you end up with long-term English learners that we're so focused on right now, and so we certainly need to address that.
There is another question that seems to be related to that one, and that question has to do with that many of the ELL students have difficulties in accessing the theoretical content or the more conceptual content. And again, what thoughts do you have on that?
Well, I think my thought is let's not underestimate the cognitive potential of the students and really think of ways in which we can give them access to those complex structures as they struggle with literacy and with language, and I think that's going to be the real challenge of the Common Core, and if we don't, the price we pay if we don't succeed in doing that is huge, because the students won't meet their graduation requirements and so forth. So we simply have to figure that out. I'm not saying I know how to do that, but it certainly creates an important problem space.
It seems, though, Kenji, that the resources that you are beginning to put up in your Understanding Language website would begin to address some of these thorny
Yes.
issues that people are raising.
We certainly hope so. We hope to, we'll probably end up raising as many questions as we'll have answers. But I think, I think, and hopefully we are past the days of one size fits all. That we understand that students come from a variety of they're just very diverse, and those of you in the Northeast know that more than those of us in California or in Texas. But students are just simply really diverse, and we just need to as a system and a field know how to be much more differentiated in what we do, and so it's not like we have answers and we'll post them on our website. It's really, here are the ways in which we've struggled and so forth, and here are some possible options, and please share with us what you're finding, and let's kind of use this current space provided by the Common Core as a way to grow as a field, to become mature and to learn how to share best practices.
So there is a question here that references slide number 32, which has to do with the challenges that you had mentioned that the Common Core standards address. So, and the question is, are there strategies to address some of these challenges?
I think that's what if you go to our sample English language arts unit, there are some strategies contained in there that will be quite familiar to those of you with some of the QTEL strategies. But I also think that we also need to become better at as teachers or as coaches or as principals or district leaders doing walkthroughs and feedback at being able to identify which of these are really productive conversations or productive engagement of language and content, and which are not just noise and verbiage being created by students. And I think part of the challenge that I think we face now is so now what? How do we, if we get kids to talk to each other, we have to get them to talk to each other in academically productive and useful ways, and we need to get better at doing that. So I guess instead of saying students are challenged to, I think we have to say we are challenged to understand these situations better.
So we're coming to almost the end of our time. So I would like to thank you, Kenji, for your sharing your thoughts here. A couple of things before I move to Pedro Ruiz and ask him to share with us some of his observations. One is that we do have a survey that we would like our participants to take. You will see it at the bottom of the screen where it says take the survey. It's really important for us that you fill that out. The Institute of Educational Sciences that funds us, and we as the RELNI want to hear your feedback about today's session. So please be sure to take that feedback survey. The other thing I just wanted to mention, there are a number of questions that have not been answered, and I just want to remind people that we will be trying to share other information with you. But I also wanted to alert you to a service that RELNI has, especially for those of you who are in our region in the Northeast, and that is that we have a service that provides reference desk assistance. So if you have a question about something that you'd like to know and want to know what research is available on that question, you can go to the RELNI website, and we have a thing there called Request Assistance Mechanism, where you can pose your question and we will do a search for the best available research to answer that question. So those of you in the Northeast, please avail yourselves of that service. Those of you who are not in our region, there is a national Ask a REL service that is the same thing. It's a reference desk service. You can pose your questions there, or sometimes your local REL will also have that service. So just check those out, and it's a great resource that many of our practitioners have been using. So I'd like to move on now and ask Pedro Ruiz to share with us some of his thoughts about the implications of the Common Core standards and what Kenji has shared with us from his perspective as a State Department of Education coordinator of Office of Bilingual Education and Foreign Language Services. As it shows, Pedro is from the New York State Education Department. Pedro?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Maria, and thank you, the Alliance, for giving us this opportunity for this webinar, as well as Dr. Hakuta for the amount of information that he has provided us today. I think, and maybe we all feel the same way, that this has opened up a can of worms of a lot more questions that need to be answered. And looking at the number of individuals that have posted questions, I think we need to have 3 or 4 more webinars like this to be able to answer each one and maybe separate them by subtopics of Common Core for ELL standards. So I think we have our work cut out for us for the next couple of months. I do think that that the questions that I was reading are just from individuals, and especially in the survey that they did before. Many people are just starting the work, as well as some that are already engaged in different facets of the implementation process and go all the way to really advance. In talking with some of my other state directors, I think that I just want to make sure that that it wasn't only my own feeling in terms of the Common Core and the implementation of the Common Core regarding ELLs that I was feeling. So, and it's great that the last slide was about the students' challenges, but based on my conversations, a lot of the challenges are not only just for students, they are well for state administrators, superintendent, principals, teachers, parents. It runs the gamut in terms of if we want to do what we're supposed to do to help our students engage and explain and do the strategies that are with complex text and so on that are demands from the Common Core. I think we all have our work cut out for us. Just in general, one of the things that kept on coming back is the implications on the Common Core and ELLs. I think there's 2 processes. One is the development of the actual crosswalk or scaffolding of the Common Core in the different levels of proficiency levels and different grade levels of the actual, standards, and how are they going to be rolled out. So that's one big piece of work that I know that has been a lot of different organizations and states have been doing a lot of work on that, and not only just for the ELP standards, but also for the Native Language Arts standards. So that's one big piece. But I think the fear out there is, how do you take that work and then put it into practice, and the implications and the ramifications of this within the code of assessments and the way that they're being developed nowadays, teacher evaluation, accountability on districts and schools under Title I and under Title III, how growth is being measured and how we're looking at it, and how we're looking at academic achievement. So there's a lot of questions regarding these pieces. And then in terms of the teachers and the schools is professional development, the need for professional development and understanding the diverse group of ELLs. We talked a lot about beginner group of ELLs, but within the ELLs we need to continue thinking that there are more than just one subgroup of ELLs. We have special ed ELLs, We have students with interrupted formal education. We have long-term ELLs. We have recent arrivals. So we need to look at all these different subpopulations and how they affect the implementation of these standards, as well as how they look in terms of how students are being assessed and how data is being used for accountability for states and districts and schools. So that's a big piece that kept on coming up in terms of the diverse subgroups. Also, the best practices in classroom instruction, it's not only about the ESL teacher, but also the mainstream teacher, as well as professional development that addresses, again, how to take our students from not knowing any English up to being able to be proficient in the language and also show academic growth and the second language acquisition process. So I think that piece kept on coming out, which I know that Dr. Hakuta referenced some of the materials out there. I think that we need to see a lot more of those materials being developed in terms of to be used for professional development. And definitely not only just for the ESL piece, but also within the native language art and instruction and the ramifications in terms of bilingual programs and dual language programs. And my last thought is about the assessment. Again, going back, I think it's we need to start looking at reform on our accountability system based on the information that was provided. If we are going to measure our kids in terms of the Common Core, I think there has to be a progression within the accountability process that measures this growth, and it's not punitive in the process of state, districts, and schools. So those are kind of my general thoughts. Again, going back, I think one of the important thing is to see if we could continue this kind of dialogues and focus forums that we can bring up some of the issues presented.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. I'm sorry, Kenji?
So would you like me to say a few things, or would
Sure,
you like
yes.
to ask questions? Or
yeah. Yeah, I don't think we'll have time for more questions, but if you could give us some parting thoughts.
Thank you, Pedro. You've kind of you've acted like a great tuning fork or set of tuning forks to all the issues that this raises around the systemic challenges and the diversity of the subgroups and the kinds of I think that it's not really the teacher acting alone, or even teacher acting with other teachers, but teachers acting within a system of supports that are offered in various kinds of systems: small school districts, large school districts, and then sort of layers of states and even the federal piece once accountability kicks in. And I think all of these are just just tell us how complex a world we're living in. And I'm just going to say that I think that if I weren't an optimist, I wouldn't be in this business because there is so much to be done, including trying to go get ahead of the curve on many of these issues. As I said, when we started out on this in the 70s and 80s, even the existence of English learners was sort of a point of debate, or how large a group and so forth. And then as the sort of the reforms in successive waves of reforms, I think we've gotten better at engaging with the key issues of the reform. And then now the Common Core is coming on. It's very complex. We're trying to kind of ride several different waves at the same time. But I have to, I wouldn't be involved in it personally if I weren't feeling optimistic that we're not going to get it right or perfect, but we'll do it better this time than we did the last time, and hopefully there won't be any sort of what might be called stupid politics that get in the way, things like English-only movements and so forth, and that occasionally serve as additional distractions. But being able to focus on the sort of the academic challenges that are being posed by the Common Core, the civil rights kinds of expectations that our students need to be challenged to not be sort of set aside as, oh no, they can't do this because this is too complicated or too difficult for them and so forth. That these are real sort of managing expectations and so forth is really important. I also have to say I just spent yesterday at a school district that was highlighted in a community that was highlighted in the New York Times about a month ago. It's called Mendota, Mendota, and it's a community that's in Central California and is one of the poorest cities in the country. Unemployment of upwards of 25%. And I spent the day there talking. It's a small district, 2,000 students, dealing with Common Core and other issues. And every time I visit small districts like that, I just walk away with a tremendous sense of optimism, actually, that in spite of the challenges that they have, that there are some incredibly dedicated, great educators working in those contexts, and that they're trying to figure it out, and they're trying to sort of be strategic about it, saying, okay, Common Core isn't going to be implementing, okay, so when it comes on, we'll just do it. They're sort of saying, well, how does that fit with what's within our capacity to shift or do things right now? They're being very thoughtful and deliberative about this within the context that they have, and really saying, how can we do this for the best, for the benefit of our students? And I don't think that they're over 80% ELLs, and so they think about ELLs all the time, but it's really it's not a sort of we'll address their English needs and then we'll address content. They're really talking about the whole child that they're trying to develop. I think that the demographics have changed so much in this country now that English learners is on top of the heap. I take great encouragement from the fact that organizations like the Council of Chief State School Officers have kind of put this as a front burner issue for them and for their member states. So I think the spotlight is on the issue and the challenges right now. And I think when we start peeling it and making it a problem of the entire community of educators, that we're going to understand that this is really complex. It's as complex as education itself. And also, kind of realizing that if we don't succeed with this population of students, the whole system won't succeed because of the demographic realities. So, but I think those challenges are there. But I also think that we're in a very different place than we were in the 70s. So
thank you, Kenji.
Yeah.
I know you have to go to another meeting, so I'm being very responsible here not to make you late for your next meeting. But I do want to thank you very much. This, I think, has brought up a lot of food for thought. I think your rallying cry that is so optimistic, and a number of people have written in that they really thank you for encouraging high expectations for English language learners. And so I just want to say that message is so important, that just because there are challenges, we shouldn't forget that actually our ELL students are highly intelligent, highly capable, and highly competent, and we just need to give them the opportunities and access to what learning they need in order to really come to their full potential. I would like to remind people to please fill out the survey. We do take your feedback very carefully. That is a way for you to let us know maybe what the next steps are that we might be able to take regarding this important topic of the Common Core State Standards and their implications for the education of English language learners, to ensure that they have access not only to the development of English as a skill, but also in terms of their content knowledge and building the knowledge that they need to be successful in their lives. So again, I just want to thank you again, Kenji. We will be in touch with you, and we hope that we will have other opportunities to present other information. And thank you also to Pedro Ruiz for being such a great discussant and pulling so many thoughts together at the end.
Thank you very much, MP.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. This concludes today's Bridge webinar from the REL Northeastern Islands. Special thanks to the English Learners Alliance, MP Avery and Shai Fuchsman. You can check back on the RELNE website. I think by Monday or so we'll have an archive of this session on the website, and anyone who registered will get a thank you with a link to the slides. And tune in next year for the English Learners Alliance's next Bridge event. Thanks very much. Have a great night.